differences in this crisis is the fact, well, coming from Asia, and I think many Latin Americans feel the same way, the crisis of the 1990s occurred at a time when remittances actually played a counter-cyclical effect, and they augmented domestic incomes in very important ways. This is not the case this time round, it appears. Again, the effects are uneven, but generally speaking, it appears that remittances are much less because of what is happening in the host country for migrant workers. Now, as far as the numbers are concerned, the numbers don't look dramatically lower. And part of the reason, of course, is that there has been a US dollar depreciation in the intervening period. So when you look at the World Bank's figures, for instance, you don't get a sense of this decline in the actual value of these remittances, but in dollar terms, it looks as if it's only dipped very slightly. Now, one important element which distinguishes the response to this crisis from, let us say, the Hoover, the Hoover administration is the fact that there has been a strong interventions on the monetary side, perhaps less strong on the fiscal side than some of us might have liked to see, but nonetheless there were early responses, particularly by the US and the UK, in some ways the two most vulnerable economies, perhaps precisely because financialization had been most advanced in those regions. Now, the reason for emphasizing this is that we have there is very clear evidence that the longer you delay your response, the lag effect actually grows with the delay in the response. So the early response is actually a very important element in trying to understand the recovery, if you will. Now, this graph is taken from my colleague Alex Izurieta over there, who basically has shown that if there was much better macroeconomic coordination in response to the crisis, you would have, everybody would basically benefit, and you would have had a much more robust recovery. This case for macroeconomic coordination is a very important point to be made, but it's also an indictment of the failure of the G7. The G7 had always justified its existence by suggesting that it was too clumsy to work with the IMF board. The other arrangements were too big and too clumsy. But it was the G7 who was going to take care of things, and they basically dismally failed. So, in a sense, it is not surprising that the G7 needs to, that President Bush didn't have any strong commitment to maintaining a G7 framework, and was quite ready to embrace the G20 framework when President Sarkozy approached him about that. Now, these are also, again, from Alex. It gives you a sense of how much more robust the recoveries would have been with much greater coordination and much greater sharing. Of course, the developed countries would benefit the most, but least developed countries would benefit the most, but developed countries would also benefit, and economies in transition as well as developing countries. Now, another point to be made, which is very obvious to all of you in this audience, is the fact that while you can have an output recovery, a jobs recovery doesn't necessarily follow. And if we look at the last two severe downturns, it's actually quite worrying. I'm not suggesting any trend, but in 1991, following SNL, the recovery, the output recovery took 3 quarters, and job recovery took 2.5 years. In 2001, output recovery took 3 quarters again, but job recovery took 4 years. Okay. Now, what will it take this time round? And I'm not sure whether we have grappled with that question in a way which is useful. Now, let me sort of. There has been international response. I think you all know that they have about what the IMF has done, the G7, and the G20. And then there have been more analytical responses. The Turner Commission should be mentioned, the Stiglitz Commission, and then the conference at the UN last year. And I think it's important to recognize that that we cannot one should not just presume that for the IMF and everybody else, it's just business as usual. There has been, not only analytically, but I want to emphasize that analytically there has been a difference in a lot of the work which came out since last year from both the Bretton Woods institutions, but also in terms of the loan conditions, there has been some change. Not as much as many of us would like, but there has been some change, and a lot of it has been politically driven. Why, for example, should Mexico, Colombia, and Poland be privileged in terms of fast-track access, whereas other countries are not? And I think the answer is not necessarily, has got very little to do with macroeconomic conditions or financial criteria. It has much more to do with political considerations. And so this, I think, underscores the continued politicization of many of the continued political influence in many of these matters. So to conclude, I think I would like to emphasize that from a developing country point of view, you have not only a higher cost of credit, but you also have generally for the smaller countries a deeper recession reflected not only by trade, but trade has become so important partly because the last 3 decades has seen a significant externalization of the economies of developing countries, reflected, for example, in the observation by the Madagascar president that in the 1980s, Africa was a net food exporter, and by the time of the food crisis 2 years ago, Africa had become a net food importer. There are many other manifestations of this, but certainly I think business as usual is not an option. There's a north-south dimension which is very important. There's the whole question of the financial sector and the non-financial sector, and I think workers have been differentially affected partly by the sectors they have been involved in. And one of the reasons I would argue why the bigger developing countries, which are members of the G20, have done reasonably, have come out of this reasonably better than other developing countries, is because the size of the domestic market makes a difference. The size of the domestic market makes it a little easier to reorient your production to the domestic economy, and with the collapse of export options, that has provided some degree of breathing space. This is certainly not an option for the smaller developing countries, and in much of the world, in Central America, in much of Africa, these are all very, very small economies, and so the export there's the continued reliance on exports is something which there's very little option to switch away from, and this is part of the problem they face. So in trying to understand the distributional effects at the global level, one has to think not only about the direct consequences of the financial crisis, but also the more general economic crisis and the preceding development crisis, which I have not even begun to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Chomo. Our next speaker will be Jane Davistam. All our speakers, in equal measure, as they are great names in economics, they are humble. So it's been a bit of a struggle for me to point out their stature and them understating their successes. So Jane is she calls it an advocate for financial reform. She's a consultant for a group of economists that work with SAFER, an association of NGOs that push for social and political economy reforms. She's a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute. She has also been a very prolific writer and has published a large number of articles and papers. She has taught at Boston University in the law program at UMass Amherst and here at the New School. And she has lately published on financial and monetary reform and is currently working on a new book with Korkut Ertürk on the monetary threat to the world economy. Jane will focus on international policy, but also on the European and US distributional effects of the crisis and the financial market regulation.
It's a great pleasure to be here, to return to the New School, and to say that what an extraordinary conference has been organized by this group of students. I'm so impressed with you. And